Hello, everyone. Let me start off this conversation with introductory comments. Good day. I am Johannes Fritz, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's Digital Policy Alert webinar on navigating AI futures, a comparative look at emerging international AI rules. Let me briefly tell you who we are to host such a conversation. The Digital Policy Alert is an independent Swiss nonprofit to support rulemaking for the digital economy worldwide. To this end, we track laws, regulation, guidance, and enforcement as they occur in 50+ markets. Every day, we publish short summaries, including official sources and on our open access website. And we hope that this transparency helps policymakers, civil society, and the private sector representative like you learn about different regulatory approaches and best practices to achieve cherished public policy objectives. It's from this organizational context that I'm super excited today for the opportunity to hold a conversation on emerging international AI rules. As AI continues to advance and reshape our world, the regulatory landscape is evolving almost just as rapidly. The EU AI Act has taken a lot of headspace in the past 6 months. And in this webinar, however, we seek to look beyond the EU AI Act and into the wider world. Our goal today is to compare notes and share valuable insights into the latest developments in AI regulations across the globe. Together, we will discuss 3 aspects across the next hour or so. First, we'll explore concrete examples of novel approaches to AI rules across the globe. Second, we'll discuss the importance of international coordination around AI rules to make sense of the broad range of regulatory activity out there. Third, we'll examine challenges and solutions for how governments and companies are translating the new regulatory environment into implementation and daily practice. Here's how we'll proceed. We'll begin with a brief round of introductions. I introduce you to the panelists, and followed by a series of focused questions to each of any one of them to explore these 3 aspects I just mentioned. After roughly 40 minutes, you will receive answers to your questions from our distinguished experts here. And for that, a few housekeeping notes right before we dive in. With me today is my colleague Tommaso Giardini. He's here to manage the Q&A process, so please make active use of the Q&A feature that you see at the bottom of your screen. Tommaso will moderate the Q&A channel during the panel discussion and then bring key questions to the Q&A section at the end. Feel free to share your thoughts and reactions in the Q&A channel as we move through the next couple of minutes. And to ensure that we have lively participation, let's kick things off by de-icing the Q&A channel right now. The attendees, the participants, please help our panel understand where our audience is based today. So please use the Q&A channel right at the bottom of your screen and drop in your location. Open the Q&A channel and just give us a sense where everyone's at. Thank you. While the responses roll in the Q&A channel, let me briefly introduce our panel for today. What makes this panel, I think, exceptional, in my view, is that it brings together a small group of people who monitor AI rules across the globe with an analytical perspective for a living. I'm excited to welcome Karine Kohn from the Center of AI and Digital Policy, CAIDP. Karine is CAIDP's Global Program Director and Europe's Executive Director. Karine is also the editor-in-chief of the publication AI and Democratic Values Index, which evaluates AI policies across 80 countries with inputs from hundreds of experts around the globe. If you want to get a concentrated yet detailed digest of a country's approach to AI, I tell you there is no better place to start. Karine, thank you so much for being here. I'm also excited to welcome Julia Schmidt from OECD AI. Julia is an economist and works in a team creating an indicator to compare AI policies across jurisdictions and to measure the progress made towards advancing the OECD AI principles. With her work within the OECD's AI Policy Observatory, Julia sits in a central hub where governments, private sector officials, and civil society come together from around the globe to discuss how to reap the benefits and to mitigate the risks of artificial intelligence. Julia, also thank you so much for being here today. And last but not least, I'm excited to welcome Joe Jones. Joe Jones is the Director of Research and Insights at the International Association of Privacy Professionals, IAPP. The IAPP is arguably the leading organization that translates global AI rules into concrete corporate policy roles and leads creating these profiles in education of much needed AI policy professionals. Joe is directly involved in IAPP's AI Governance Center and their international AI governance law overviews. He brings a deep understanding of corporate policy implementation, but also the global perspective of what's going on in international AI rulemaking. Joe, thank you to you for being here today. So fantastic. So let me see what we've learned about our audience today. Thank you everyone for using the Q&A channel. We have the attendees largely from Europe, but there's also some from Africa. Thank you for those people in Canada for starting early, and for our participants in India and Singapore to stay up late. It's clear that we have a nice and diverse and insightful audience today, so let's harness that collective wisdom throughout the session, but now turn to our panelists. Going straight into the first aspect that we want to highlight today, the novel approaches to AI rules across the globe. Joe, I'd like to start with you before I bring in Julia and Karine. Joe, what's currently happening in AI rulemaking around the world that has caught your eye, and what's interesting you about it?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Johannes, and thank you for this initiative and your leadership on these issues. It's great to be on the panel. It's great to see such a global audience and global levels of engagement. So let me start with that. We're seeing an incredibly vibrant and varied regulatory ecosystem when it comes to AI governance. I think a lot of people in this space, people on this panel, have been working in digital policy and digital governance for many years. And it has sometimes, not oftentimes, felt like the sort of backwater where there's been one or two key movers and others have followed or taken inspiration. But here on AI regulation, on AI law and policy, we've just got this vast proliferation of activity. I mean, just this week we had an announcement from the African Union trying to cohere a more regional approach to the innovative and the strategic, as well as the safety and governance components of AI. We, of course, have the EU AI Act that has been adopted now and is going to be published in the EU's official journal soon. But we've got very different approaches, and AI and the policy decisions around AI tap into a lot of political, a lot of geopolitical policy and cultural decisions that countries are taking. How far to go, how fast to move, the role of government, the role of private sector, and the ways in which they can work together. Some really interesting case studies that come to mind for me that I've been looking at quite closely is the work that's happening in Singapore, where we do not have, yet at least, a dedicated specific AI law. There are lots of laws and policies that apply to AI and AI governance, but there's no Singaporean AI Act as such. There we have seen how the regulator working with industry has been working on voluntary testing procedures through what's called AI Verify. And this is really something that has taken root in other parts of the region, in Southeast Asia, and other parts of the world. You only have to look at the United States as well with the NIST framework, the United Kingdom, which is where I'm from, where there are lots of laws that combine and are collated to apply to AI governance, but there isn't a UK AI Act as such. So lots of different approaches around the world. I think the question for a lot of organizations at the moment is, what will be the enduring model? What will sustain? AI and its need for large data sets that require cross-border data flows. It craves a more coherent, cohesive approach. Organizations want to, more often than not, have a sort of singular unitary approach that they can tweak in different markets, not wholesale, very different approaches in different markets. So, and I know we'll come on to the role and the work of standards bodies and organizations to try and make that cohesion work. But there are lots of developments around the world, UK, Singapore, the United States. I think some of the work that we've seen at a political level through what started in Bletchley in the United Kingdom with the Bletchley Declaration that then moved to South Korea and Seoul Summit, shows the power and the seriousness at the highest levels to create norms, voluntary commitments, voluntary standards, new structures through AI safety institutes that we're seeing around the world now in the United States, UK, and elsewhere. So there's a huge amount happening. It's almost this sort of breathless activity that is quite hard to track and trace and map to each other.
Well, thank you, Joe, for this opening statement. I agree. We share this observation that in this current environment, there's lots of activity coming from the highest level, but it also has this opportunity for objectively rather small countries like Singapore to lead the way with innovative approaches. And that's why I think having you all here in the panel and share a bit what you are seeing is so important and so interesting. So Julia, may I hand over to you? What's on your desk? What strikes your eye?
Thanks, Johannes. It's really a true pleasure to be here with you today and with Joe and Karin. Thank you for this invite. I think the panel is very topical, and I'm already excited about how this discussion is moving forward. So from the OECD, I mean, our position allows us to bring together a wide range of stakeholders, from government officials and business representatives to civil society and academia. And this allows us to have this kind of bird's eye view of what is happening. And of course, I need to come with a little bit of data, as we have this slogan, data-driven policy. So here in my team, we have this OECD AI Observatory, where we try to monitor recent trends, and we observe exactly what Joe was describing. In 2016, we only had a handful of countries that had, for instance, national AI strategies. And then now this year, in 2024, we could document over 1,000 AI-related policy initiatives across 70 jurisdictions. And I just checked, of these, more than 350 relate to somehow AI guidance and regulation. And I think I can really corroborate what Joe was describing. We've seen many countries in the OECD taking a cross-sectoral approach to AI regulation, building on AI-specific regulatory frameworks like Canada, like the European Union. We have other adherents that consider more sectoral approaches, like the United Kingdom, as mentioned. And what is interesting for us, also because we have new accession processes at the OECD with new members joining us, is what we observe in Latin America, where countries are now moving forward with binding AI regulation. One example is Peru, but also the proposed AI bill. I mean, it's in the making in Brazil, which has some similarities with the EU AI Act, following a risk-based approach, and also links to the OECD AI principles. I'm happy to elaborate on that later. And then the other part that I wanted to bring our attention to is more soft law guidance, or like experimentation, regulatory experimentation sandboxes specifically. They are one requirement in the EU AI Act, and they started, I think we recorded Spain in collaboration with the European Commission being the first that created an AI regulatory sandbox in 2022 as a pilot to test how the proposed EU AI Act could interact with real AI applications and how regulation and applications respond. And two other examples, I mean, there are really a range of those. But just to give a feeling for them, there's in 2023, France followed with an initiative that offered targeted support to selected projects, providing them with expert guidance on integrating and complying also with the GDPR. And Norway, I think, is also another interesting example. They focus or especially frame it around ethical, privacy-friendly, and responsible AI innovation, with a focus on like private sector companies to develop AI solutions. And we also try, and there I link back to our data approach to measure those kind of sandboxes, how many are there, which countries plan for them, what type of, are they already implemented? And I think, to kind of close the bracket, I think we see exactly this huge increase in different initiatives, and I'm looking forward to delve deeper in the next section of this panel into how we coordinate around them. So back to you, Johannes.
Thank you so much, Julia. Again, this image that we start off with something that's very niche. It's almost like an inverted pyramid that we have now, where we start at a very location, 2016, and now it spreads out into all dimensions. It's very big. Everything is touched. And as you said, there's sectoral. We have major design choices that we see across the globe, meaning from sectoral approaches to horizontal ones. You mentioned that risk-based versus non-risk-based. And also I thought it's very interesting how you explained that even within a jurisdiction, say like the EU, there is not a single the binding approach versus the more lightweight approach, but there is variation, as you say. Again, there is sandboxes in the EU, there's sandboxes everywhere. So we have this distinction also with what kind of approach to take, even within the same jurisdiction. Thank you so much, Julia. Karin, what is striking your fancy these days?
Hi, and thank you very much, Johannes, for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. So just for a clarification on our perspective, the Center for AI and Digital Policy and CIDP and its European branch, CIDP Europe's, aim to promote a better society, more fair, more just, a world where technology promotes broad social inclusion based on fundamental rights, democratic institutions, and the rule of law. So we have a human-centric approach to AI and its regulation. And the way we approach it actually, and we understand it, is that AI poses global challenges to human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. So in order to be efficient in tackling these challenges, we need to foster human-centric convergence in terms of regulation. And in our AIDV index that we issued in the last version, we issued in 2024, and which covered the entire 2023, the shift that we have been observing is that we shifted from whether to regulate AI to how to regulate AI. So indeed, we have been assessing the public policies of 80 countries, but I would like to make a caveat here, because we have to be careful to not transplant to other systems our own way of looking at things. And it's very important when we try to assess not only transplant rules, but also assess these systems, which is part of your question. So for example, with regard to Singapore, we have to remember that Singapore is not a democratic country. So yes, there is no AI regulation per se, but the model AI frameworks and data frameworks that the Infocom Media Development Authority has been regularly issuing are binding. So I think we have to be very careful here. And for example, even last week, we saw that Infocom, the MDI, published the Model AI Governance Framework for Generative AI, a document which aims to address the risks and challenges associated with the development and deployment of generative AI. And what is also interesting is that the document highlighted the importance of global collaboration, stating that the aim is to establish a global digital commons, a place with common rules of the road and equal opportunities for all citizens to flourish, regardless of their geographical location. So I say that it is on this basis that we are looking at an upward convergence in terms of regulation of AI, not transferring our own way of understanding of what is regulation and modes of regulations. But also what is very important, I think, in this regard, since the key question has been is how to regulate AI, and we've also switched now in 2024 to how to enforce the regulations that are in place and all the rules that are in place. It is that in order to identify good practices, we need to look around and beyond our national borders. So if I take the last edition of our AIDV index, maybe surprisingly for some Europeans or people in North America, the countries that have been ranked on top are Canada for North America, one country in North America, 2 Asian countries, Japan and Korea, 1 Latin country, Colombia, and 2 European countries, Slovenia and the Netherlands. So when in Europe we say, woohoo, we got the EU AI Act, let's remember that Singapore had rules regulating AI since 2019, and they adopted it based on the concerns they had regarding ChatGPT-2. Well, when we were looking at the EU AI Act, we included rules regarding GPI models because suddenly we discovered ChatGPT-4. So I think it's very important to look at practices and good practices elsewhere and the issues that people have been concerned about in order to decide what to regulate and how to regulate. And here, if I may, since you asked us to look at countries outside Europe, I would like to take the example of Colombia, because Colombia is a country which we, in Europe, for example, we do not necessarily look at, but it's a very interesting example, and I say it ranks at the top of our assessment. So, for example, now in Europe, we are talking about developing sandboxes. Well, Colombia has been developing sandboxes inside their DPA supervisions since 2022, so already 2 years ago. If we look at the AI roadmap to ensure the ethical and sustainable adoption of AI in Colombia, which Colombia adopted recently in 2024, we see that actually they address the use of AI for national security and defense purposes. And the roadmap highlights the necessity of an ethical and transparent framework to guarantee the protection of Colombian citizens. It is quite interesting when we look at what is happening in Europe, and we see that the big debate regarding the EU AI Act was how big the caveat will be with regard to national security, the use of AI for national security purposes. And we saw the same dilemma regarding the negotiation of the Council of Europe Convention on AI, democracy, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Another key point, for example, Colombia has been looking at establishing an AI register for public administrations. So it is quite interesting because they've been doing it, they've been suggesting it since 2021 and have been working on this idea since then. And last year, what was adopted is the Ibero-American Charter on AI in Civil Services. So there is a coordination movement in LATAM countries to develop these AI registries for public administrations. It is interesting because, for example, it resonates with the G7 leaders communique that was just issued, which welcomes the G7 toolkit for AI in the public sector. And the hope is to look at these examples coming from the different parts of the world and not necessarily focus on what we've been doing. Because, for example, in Europe, we have been developing best practices with regard to public registers but they've been developed by municipalities across Europe, not at the level of public administration. And we are just now reflecting upon how to develop this public register administration and what they should contain because of the various scandals that we got, like the UK postmaster scandal or the Dutch social benefits scandal. So I think it is quite interesting in this way to look at other examples. And one last example, if I may, would be that we heard a lot in Europe, for example, in 2023, and it continues in 2024, regarding the investigation concerning OpenAI. So we had the Italian investigation, we had some in Canada. But what is less known is that already in May 2023, the Colombian DPA has launched an investigation to assess whether ChatGPT complies with Colombia data protection law. And this investigation was based on the coordinated action initiated by the RED data protection authorities. RED are the Ibero-American, the Iberic data protection authorities, and it was an investigation on OpenAI. Why is it important? Because, for example, right now, the EDPB just issued a report that was prepared by its task force on generative AI. And another important point is that the RED DPAs also looked at the issue of disinformation. And we know that, for example, in Europe, we looked at disinformation through the DSA, which has Digital Services Act, which has recently been adopted. So I think that in order to regulate AI, because as I said, it's not whether we regulate AI, but how we regulate it, because if we don't regulate it, others will do it for us. The question is really to look around us, identify the best practices, maybe work together, but not simply towards interoperability, I would say, but towards an upward convergence. to ensure the protection of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. That's what I would say on this topic.
Yeah. Let's come back to that notion of conversions. Let me take 3 takeaways that I had from this. Really, one can see the wealth that is inside this initiative. So I think you added 3 layers to the complexity of it all. You said this is not only about making rules, but this is also about enforcement. So I think your illustration is very nice that you picked for the Colombians moving first, and how will that translate elsewhere? Also, we are not only thinking here about the private sector, but you said your government is also a heavy user of AI technology. What are we going to do there? And so I think this really helps us with the last point, this fascination that I have with this topic, that we have lots going on, and it is both an opportunity and a risk. So the opportunity is because countries, as you illustrate, move at different speeds. We had Singapore being early in one area, the European Union probably in another, and Colombia in the third area. We have the opportunity to learn from other regulatory approaches about this multifaceted beast that we are supposed to regulate and put rules on. That's the opportunity there. At the same time, it's this risk of interoperability, heterogeneity, divergence in regulatory rules that, if it festers, would not be probably reaping the entirety of the potential of the innovation. And I think this is really nice when we can now turn to the second aspect of our conversation, where it's about the importance of international coordination in helping us organize this high impact, high impetus movement to regulate artificial intelligence. All your examples illustrated that activity is very high. We have it in every tracker. Encouraging, though, as mentioned already in some of your statements, from an international perspective, intergovernmental cooperation around AI has also picked up. You mentioned Bletchley Park, Joe. There's the OCDI principles you mentioned, even that American coordination around privacy in the very early days. Karin, one high-profile forum for international coordination is obviously the OECD, and which also has issued the famous OCDI principles already in 2019, recently updated just in May. And Julia, can you briefly take us a bit to set the stage? Can you take us through the OECDI principles in broad strokes as an example for how governments coordinate around building regulatory frameworks around AI?
Yes, sure. Thanks a lot, Johannes and Karin as well. I think it really set the stage. At the OECD, we really believe, I mean, we say empathetically yes to, we need international coordination at this stage already. I mean, as we've seen, I mean, there's this worry around fragmentation already, a lot of legal complexities, but also for companies, compliance costs that could go up. And for us, it would be promoting interoperability first between the various AI governance approaches. And this is where basically these OECD AI principles come in. This is also where we come in as OECD. We need, but what it means for us, interoperability, is really that we aim to align definitions, terminology, methodologies to assess risk. So this is really important. And as we are a standard setter, I mean, we're not only a forum to bring member states together, we also have in the past had a series of different standards. The OECD member countries really move together to collectively develop and commit to such legal instruments. None of them are binding. So that's a feature of the OECD recommendations on AI as well. And I think first, to take us through them, it's important that we kind of have this definition of an AI system that has been used also in the EU AI Act, but I've seen it also more and more used in academic citations. I think it's really great. And they were really negotiated, this definition, and revised to keep up with the fast-paced speed of technology by all member countries. And then, as Johannes already said, we set up back in 2019 the recommendation on AI, which are 10 foundational principles for trustworthy AI. So there are 5 value-based principles. And I mean, maybe we can put the link in the chat later. I can do that. But I think just to give an example, so there are these 5 value-based principles and 5 policy recommendations. And amongst those 5 value-based principles are quite high level ones like sustainable growth or human-centric approach. And that's also where we connect to what Karin says. One is also transparency. For instance, transparency is committed to responsible disclosure of AI systems, and AI systems should provide meaningful information appropriate to the context, consistent with the state of art. And for just an example, linking to that, we are just in the process of developing or designing a survey on trust in AI, where we will also try to assess public perception around exactly that principle. So I think this is really interesting to go back to link like what people think to what these principles mean. And then on the policy side, also let me grasp an example. I mean, we have different pillars of these policy recommendations linked to research and development, jobs and skills, the policy environment, international cooperation. But one interesting one is also this AI enabling ecosystem. And I think one component here is, for instance, compute power. That's something very concrete we see here. So in order to have an AI system work, we need algorithms, we need data, and we also need compute power. And this is linking to geopolitical relevance. It's highly sensitive, and it's difficult to assess. And what we're currently trying to do, also in a collaboration with the University of Oxford, is to assess public compute capacity by country. So we know like big cloud providers, what they offer, but basically to see, okay, can we break it down to these regional compute clusters? I think it's really something highly relevant in the future. And I hope I gave a bit of a flavor of how these principles, I mean, what they are, why we change them, and then also how we link them to concrete assessments or like monitoring. And these were just indicator examples, but of course we will regularly do stock taking exercises and also country reviews. Just recently, I think last week, we launched a Germany country review in collaboration with the German Chancellery. So we are really in an ongoing dialogue to ensure that these principles make sense and kind of create some sort of space for countries to come together, for member states to come together and see how they can adjust and develop policies based on them. So I think stop here.
Well, thank you, Julia, for giving us a look under the hood at what's going on in the OECD AI principles. And as you said, it starts in the very minutiae, the really small things like agreeing on a definition of what's the thing we are about to regulate AI systems. And then I think it's worth noting that, we try to get feedback from the public on if what you're doing is perceived as doing the right thing. And then again, coming to this double quest that we are currently on, regulating it, but also reaping its innovative potential. So the enabling environment you talked about, and then this obviously goes into geopolitics and everything, which brings me back to something that you said, Karin, early on, where you said it's also important to have these rules, but these rules also have to be interpreted in cultural context because they are grasping our private and personal lives. This is something that's very different across cultures and regions. So if you can pick one other set of principles, another guidebook that seeks to harmonize international rulemaking, such as the UNESCO AI Convention or anything of your picking, and just contrast it a bit where you see differences and emphasis between the OECD principles, say, and that one of your pick. Thank you so much, Karin. You're on mute, Marine. Karin.
So actually, to answer your question, I will track back a bit to the OECD AI principles, because, for example, in our OECD AI and Democratic Values Index, some of our key benchmarks regard the OECD AI principles and the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI. And we look at both adoption, whether a country has adopted these principles, and whether they've been concretely applied. So because without these two dimensions, it might be, the assessment might not be exactly accurate. And what we see in terms of convergence with regard to the OECD principles is, as Julia mentioned, there are 5 value-based principles, which regards responsible stewardship of trustworthy AI. And in it, we have respect for the rule of law, human rights, and democratic values, including fairness and privacy. And we also have transparency and explainability. And here it's quite interesting because we can link it, transparency and explainability, we can directly link it to the GDPR, but we can also link it to the Council of Europe Convention 108+, which is about to enter into force and which applies very complete, I would say, principles of our right to algorithmic transparency. So it's quite interesting. And we also have another principle, which is accountability. And you asked me about the differences, but in this regard, we see a convergence between the OECD AI principles and the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI. The added value of the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI is that it has been endorsed by 193 countries in the world. So it is a nice benchmark as well, precisely because of the different cultures, but also the different issues that countries might encounter and citizens might encounter in these different countries. And what is very interesting with regard to the UNESCO recommendation is that first, they give concrete examples for each principle. So it's good, it's easier for countries to implement them. Second, they also put into place a readiness assessment methodology, which allows the countries basically to fill in a questionnaire to see where they stand and which measures they could put into place according to their own methodology and legal systems. So that's also interesting. But what is very interesting again as well is that they don't have just a top-down approach, they also have a bottom-up one. And how they've been doing, the UNESCO has been collaborating with various countries around the world. And for example, in the LATAM and in Africa. And basically, they are helping some countries building their national AI strategy, taking into consideration the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI, which means that basically these countries are taking really into account the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI and looking at the best practice identified and the key principles and concrete example. So that's what I would say about that. And here I would say there is also a key concern of us, I must say, is that the safety agenda should not replace the fairness agenda. And the added value of both the OECD AI principles and the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI is that they do exactly that. They really deal with the fairness agenda and a human-centric approach. And it is very important as well, and we see it also at global level, because in the Apulia's Leaders Communique, the G7 leaders reaffirmed that commitment to promoting safe, yes, secure, yes, but also trustworthy AI that aligns with shared democratic values and respect for human rights. So I would say in the end, the point is not so much for us to see where are so much the divergence, but how we can come together to foster this global upward convergence towards ensuring human-centric AI. And the OECD AI principles and the UNESCO recommendation play a key role in this regard, and a very concrete one. It's not just principles. They are really being applied, and we at CADP, we are here to help countries figure out as well how to take them into consideration.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Karine. Absolutely. So for sending this message of convergence, even between different fora to coordinate around AI rules. Also the notion that you picked in that there are other conventions that can be plugged in, something that AI, regulating AI is not something that starts from zero. We have relevant precedents or related acts already. Joe, and let's step to from the very high level of principles. In the PEP call, you talked a bit about the role of standards to make sense of the entirety of AI regulation going on. Can you elaborate a bit on us for that? What role that plays to raise international coordination?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And let me start with a bit of historical context. I think a lot of the interest and activity in standards previously has really been because the questions and issues around AI governance may have felt a little inchoate, ephemeral, not super tangible. They were grounded in ethics. and ethical discussions. And so they really did need a bridge to translate what might have been ethics into something tangible and implementable by organizations. And so a lot of standards bodies did a lot of really good work to do that translation. You made a point earlier, Johannes, about the importance of a shared language. On AI, more than lots of issues, it's so important to have that shared vernacular, because you will have lawyers talking with engineers, talking about policy, talking across borders. These are cultural, these are complex, these are legal, technical issues. So the role of standards has been very important. However, in the present day, I think there's a different emerging issue, which is the role of regulation. And regulation, where it is binding and where it has force and teeth and is paired with robust enforcement, I think that is a greater calling for organizations to implement practices. And so we will see the sort of Brussels effect or otherwise of the AI Act. We'll see the effect of legislative requirements coming online around the world, and what that means for those past standards that were made in an era where we were talking about the translation of ethics into practice. However, I think in the future, standards are going to be incredibly important in a different way. They're going to be really important in terms of cohering the different approaches that exist in legislation. I think we're looking at a future where different jurisdictions come to quite different conclusions and outcomes in terms of the form and means of AI governance and practice. Some may focus on high risk, some may focus on transparency, some may focus on safety. Some may do all of it to a greater or lesser extent. And I think standards will be a really important arena for the development of, well, what is it as a company, as a government, as an organization that we need to do if we're working across borders. At the moment, we see a lot of work happening within national borders to pair up standards work with other countries. The US NIST, Risk Management Framework for AI, has a crosswalk, which is to say it's a sort of comparison exercise that has been agreed with its Singaporean counterpart, AI Verify. I think we'll see more initiatives like that, crosswalks between different standard systems, different frameworks. And of course, we've got the great work that's happening at the OECD to build that repository of what's common, what's different, and how are the different approaches making sense. So I think standards will have its moment. Its moment might be more important when there's more law policy on the table that maybe is binding and that needs translated. If you are a relatively small or medium-sized company and you're thinking, we have finite resources to focus on AI governance, where should we turn to make sure we're doing the right thing? I think the natural impulse for many is the law, and how do we comply with the law? To shift that mindset, to move it into, well, here's some ethical frameworks, here's some standards across borders, that takes some time.
So thank you, fascinating. I think this idea of a crosswalk, or how it really gets to the very specific, to the standard setting, and then making sure that those standards have a coherence to them. You mentioned the importance of a shared language, of a common language around these rules in general. I think this leads us nicely to the last segment before we go into a Q&A. Tommaso tells me we already have a few good questions, so please keep them coming, and we'll have some time shortly. Just to wrap it up from our side for the panelists, the idea, this last notion of, we have seen a lot of activity. We've seen international coordination going on at different levels, as you guys discussed. Now, for the day-to-day, translating and implementing these rules in daily practice, both in government agencies, but as well as companies, we have to see that they are applied consistently. And I've asked all of you panelists to share examples of early success stories or in this translation process, but also of challenges. So if you want, Julia, please share a brief from the OECD, and then let's have it with Karim and Joe as well.
Sure. Thank you so much. So I will be brief because I think I'm excited to go also in the Q&A and have this exchange with everyone. So as the OECD is a forum for exchange, I think what is important for us is we collaborate with over 600 experts in my team in various expert groups, like as Karim also has alluded to. We have group on AI risk and accountability, on AI data and privacy, to bring together these two debates, also on AI futures, just to name a few. And I think one example where we have a challenge, where these groups bring together a very diverse set of experts. And in one of the groups, we on compute and environment, we brought together the University of Oxford on this academic research that I already mentioned on estimating compute capacity in the country, and then experts from businesses, from large cloud providers. And you can imagine how sensitive the discussion becomes. But I think personally, it's really pivotal to have these discussions, to communicate, precisely because this is how we shape policy in the end and how we can come to an agreement. And then the second point I want to mention is that we are also in the process, like building on responsible business conduct guidelines for AI to really help companies, or like provide guidance to companies. They build on the M&E guidelines that the OECD has set up in the past. This is something that will come in the future. And where we are standing now is that we have conducted a mapping exercise to understand the scope of existing AI risk management frameworks and how they align and can be integrated into the OECD guidance. And a unique aspect of these planned work is that it will be targeted at all actors in the AI value chain. And this will go really from companies providing financing, hardware, and other resources towards the development of AI systems, and companies developing, deploying, and using AI systems. So I stop here. I'm handing back to Johannes and look forward to the Q&A.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so Joe or Karine, final thoughts on how, or examples of how these challenges are met, how solutions are found. Karine, do you want to go first? Or Joe?
Okay, so very quickly as well, to leave some time for the Q&A. Basically, I think that the questions that a lot of practitioners and even civil society organization and everyone who is looking at how regulation is going on and how we're going to apply the regulations in force in the EU. I'm going to talk about the EU. Is how we're going to put together these different these different legislative pieces dealing with digital issues. So we have the GDPR, we have the DSA, we have the DMA. For the EU Act, we have the risk management system for developers, but actually this risk management system for developers contain a human rights impact assessment. We have the fundamental rights impact assessment for deployers. Again, it's about fundamental rights. We have the issue of systemic risks for JPI models, but systemic risks, again, to human rights. And here we have different kind of rules which apply. For JPI models, we have codes. We will have codes. For high-risk systems and the risk management system, we should have standardization. And so not only we have a different kind of rules which will concretely implement the legislative framework, but we are unsure about here the interoperability of these different frameworks. So one word, I think that the way to find this convergence is to keep with the European approach, which is a rights-based approach. Because as I mentioned, all these risk-based approach are focused on preserving human rights. And I think if we go back to standardization, and just one word about that, standardization in the framework of the risk management systems for high-risk system, I think it is utterly unfair to dump on standardization process and self-regulation the task to draft rules with regard to protection of human rights. They have not the experience to do that. They usually do technical standards. Now we are at social technical standards. It's going to be very difficult. It creates problems of legal certainty. So the way we look at it is that really, if we look from a rights-based perspective, we might be able to fix some of the loopholes, and we will see whether actually the standardization process makes sense or whether there's been a delegation of the legislative process which is not legal under EU law and which violates EU law, and in which case the standards actually would not be able to be validated by the Commission, or if the Commission validates them, I can already tell you that some organizations will ask for these standards to be squashed by the Court of Justice. And we leave it at that. But basically, there's a lot of legal uncertainty right now, and we will see how it goes.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you, Julia, for highlighting the role of creating guidelines for companies directly. And you, Karine, with this notion that the kinds of standards we're drawing up are very different animal than also already complicated health and safety standard, but we are now entering very different territory and not sure whether the regulators have the mandate or the capacity to handle that. Joe, you finish us off here. What is a challenge or a solution you're looking at?
Yeah, and actually it's a great segue. Oh, it's related really to the point that Karine was just mentioning and your summation of that, Johannes, which is to say, if we think that there is some, and let's just stick with the EU example for a minute. If we think that there is complexity and challenge, maybe even some conflict between the sort of alphabet soup of EU regulation, DSA, DGA, the Data Act, GDPR, the AI Act. If we think that there is some complexity and challenge there, and if you combine that with the rapidity of technological change and innovation, just think how organizations are set up to respond to that. Right? You know, companies, businesses, and governments, they are looking at this thinking, well, how do we structure ourselves? And I know board structure and organizational structure may not be the issues that are top of mind for lawmakers and policymakers, but organizations' structures are what make them put measures into practice, right? The ways that they can triage, identify, and manage risk. Who does the work? And the implementation of these laws, not just by the regulators and lawmakers, but by organizations, it's often not thought about in as much detail as perhaps it could be during the lawmaking process. Who is going to do this work? What tools are they going to leverage, and how are they going to leverage those tools? How are they going to engage with regulators and peers and test their processes and their assumptions when they build these components? I'll give a good example. Is the interrelationship potentially between data protection and privacy impact assessments and algorithmic impact assessments, or fundamental rights impact assessments as they are in the AI Act. Lots of people in the industry will be thinking, well, I'm going to do my best to leverage the impact assessments I've got already. I've already been doing privacy impact assessments for some time. I'm going to leverage those for AI. I think that a lot more thought needs to be given as to how organizations can do that successfully. Otherwise, you're going to get very divergent approaches. Some companies will be reinventing the wheel from scratch, and it's going to be challenging for regulators, especially where regulators and companies have interrelated, complementary, or even conflicting interests. Privacy law, competition law, online safety. I'll yield. I'm keen to give way so that we also have some questions from our audience too.
Thank you. So Tommaso, thank you, Joe, for making this point about really the workforce challenge and the leveraging challenge of combining something that we know in other contexts, but now applying to a very different setup, such as impact assessments. Really good endpoint to this discussion. So thanks you all for now. Let's turn it over to our audience. Tommaso, please take us to the Q&A.
Very well. So thank you very much to the active Q&A chat. I will try to cherry pick a couple because we only have 5 minutes left. And some of these we will answer too bilaterally. So we'll reach out to Yassine and Gianfranco specifically. I'm sorry for leaving you out here. So I'll start with Anna's question, which is how to approach regulatory interoperability. So in view of so many laws and regulations, what are actionable steps here? Anyone can go.
I'm happy to go first, and then I can be brief. One of the things we saw in a data protection privacy context was this sort of race to the top. It became very hard for organizations to implement tailored jurisdictional approaches, especially to the extent that they perceived there to be gaps or tensions between those approaches. We saw a lot of companies say, we will be GDPR around the world. I think that sustained for a period of time. We actually just concluded a survey, and we found that that's no longer the case for a majority of companies. A lot of companies adopt a single approach and then they tweak it based on the markets. So as a practical measure, I do think it helps to have a benchmark. I do think consulting the various instruments that Karine and Julia have been mentioning are really helpful to help form that benchmark, and then working out what some of the key issues are and how they differ in certain markets. It's really this mapping exercise across jurisdictions, across frameworks.
Yes, and what I would say is that in the AIDV index, what we've seen is that there has been GDPR or Brussels effect, that we already see the uptake of a risk-based approach in different countries elsewhere. And for companies that have to, which wonder, what should I do? I would say that the point is, for example, for Europe, is for companies to be able to operate in Europe. If they do not respect the rules, they cannot operate in Europe, and this is one of the biggest markets in the world. So I would say align with the standards, I mean, with the rules that are done in Europe. If you align with these rules, you're almost sure you will comply with the others all around the world. So I would say just upward convergence is a solution, of course.
Yeah, very well. I'll jump to the next question, Julia. I hope you forgive me here for skipping. So the second question comes from Milena. Milena is asking, what are the reasons for sector-specific AI regulation, and why does comprehensive horizontal AI legislation seem to progress so slowly? May this be connected? I'll have to hand this over to Julia because he didn't get to answer the first one.
I think it would. I don't want to pass it on, but I think Joe would be. I mean, I don't know. Joe would be much better placed. I'm happy to take the other questions on the observatory and the data flow.
All right, so I'll go over to that question then. So we'll close with that one. The question is, what's the difference between the OECD's AI policy database and the digital policy alerts AI tracking?
Okay, I hope Johannes will forgive me if I mean, so first, I'm the OECD AI Observatory, so it's really monitoring of a lot of different trends. So happy to share the link, but you can see that we have a lot of high frequency third-party data. Like, I think interesting to look at is, for instance, on investments, so we can trace VC investments related to AI, specifically research and development. We have also interesting data from GitHub and Stack Overflow that allows us to really track contributions to AI from the software community, developer community. That's just examples. So we have these live kind of trends and data news, for instance, but then we also have this more policy-oriented repository where we track the different initiatives, as I already mentioned. But this is on a relatively high level still, because it's just the sheer volume. And what Johannes and the St. Gallen Endowment have been doing on the digital policy alert, for us, it's complementary, it's much more detailed, and they really go inside these jurisdictions, like the legal texts, and they can kind of assign to what extent the different legal frameworks align, for instance, to the OECD AI principles. So we really honored that they map it to them. And we hope in the future, and this is already in the making, and I'll let Johannes compliment if I mean, there's way more to say about the digital policy alert, but we really hope to work together to build indicators on regulation. So really excited about that.
Thank you, Julia, for the kind words. If you want to know more about digital policy alert, always reach out to us. Her assessment is exactly right. They have a more comprehensive scope. We have a part of that. We look at really the regulation of digital services all around AI, but go deep and fast on all those different issues. I'll have it at that, please. To finish off our conversation here, and thanks for all these questions in the Q&A, let's turn over to Joe and come back to this question about sectoral versus horizontal as our end note for the conversation today. Joe, you have the word.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's an accurate observation as a general rule. I think that the main reason that I would offer is that AI is not a singular thing, and it does not have singular outcomes, results in singular applications. And because of that, it can be very challenging to draft, pass a law, notwithstanding the fact that we have seen that happen. It can be very challenging to do that because you invite questions and scrutiny, and feedback on the entire spectrum of AI in use, AI in action. And it can often be easier from a sort of subject matter expertise perspective to look at these things in its vertical columns, right? AI in financial services, what are the use cases which it arises, what are the types of risks, and then what are the safeguards that can be applied? We know the technology in that application, we know the actors, and we know the measures and the means that they can use to implement AI governance. So that's why I think we have seen more proliferation of activity when it comes to the verticals and the sectors. But of course, with any sort of proliferating sectoral framework, you always have the risk that there will be a lack of coordination and inconsistency between the sectors. Many organizations sit across different sectors, and so that they would feel that particularly acutely, which is where you have a sort of call, including a call by some in industry for more horizontal, more comprehensive, if I could say that, AI regulation.
Very interesting, especially the last note, the advantages to horizontal compared to sectoral. Very interesting, everybody. I'll wrap it up here because we're already a bit over time. Thank you for everybody sticking around. It's been a really fascinating discussion for me. We went from the beginning describing the high dimensionality of the beast, the much activity. We've heard examples from Singapore, Colombia, got some details there. Went into international coordination, where we got hopeful news about how the OECD tries to make its principles come to life and ensure convergence with others. The UNESCO, Karine talked about how the UNESCO maps in and how there are still cultural differences that have to be accepted. Going into Joe, talking about the role of standards, a common language to really discuss this very issue, which brings us to the last point, the quest for interoperability as much as possible and feasible given the public objectives that we all have here. And yeah, I'll take it with the last one, the sectoral coordination issue. And, we have cross-sector operations that also may warrant maybe a horizontal approach, even though at the face of it, sectoral rules have their sense and have their history. So thank you very much. This has been past my wildest expectations. I really enjoy listening to you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Karine, for coming. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for Tommaso for moderating the Q&A. And thank you for we participants to coming around. It's been a blast. Reach out to us. I'm Johannes Fritz from Digital Policy Alert. Have a good rest of your day.